We're next going to talk about a few subquery expressions. They're called exist in, not in, any, some, and all. I actually don't use these all that often, but you will see them used quite frequently, especially exist and in are fairly commonly used. They can usually, whatever you accomplish using these, you can usually accomplish pretty easily using a join statement instead. And I prefer joins for some reason, so I typically use those. But you will see these used by other people, and you might have a preference for these. So I'm going to go through how they work. I'm going to do a problem that we're going to be applying using all these. We're going to have a problem where we're going to try to find all suppliers that are of supplier category toy supplier or novelty goods supplier. And in the results, we want to include supplier category name, supplier name, and phone number. And we're going to solve this problem using exist in, not in, any, some, and all. But let's first take a look at the ERD diagram to find out where we should pull all this information from. So phone number and supplier name comes from the supplier table, and supplier category name comes from supplier category table. And notice to link up these two, I have to use this intersect table here, because supplier ID equals to supplier ID here, and supplier category ID equals to supplier category ID here. And this table again is here because we have a many-to-many relationship. I'm going to then go ahead I'm going to start by saying select, because I know I want these things. Okay, but before I start typing this now, let's talk about what in does. And we have actually already seen in, where we used in a where statement to replace multiple ors. So we said where state in Kansas, Utah, or Colorado. And if state was either one of these three values, then this expression would return true. Well, instead of having a list of hard-coded values like this, we can have a query or a subquery that returns some sort of results, and that result is used to compare to the values in the state column. Importantly though, this subquery should only return one column. If it returns two columns, you will get an error. So the general syntax is that you have some sort of select statement from, and you can have other things like joins and things like that, but then you have a where statement, and that's where this in statement comes. You have some sort of column that's going to be compared to the values that are returned by a subquery. So here I'm going to go ahead and say that we're going to select from, and I'm going to say from supplier. And normally you will see me do a join here now to get the information from these other two tables I need so that I can get the category name, and also do an where statement to check that it's either toy supplier or a novelty goods supplier. But here, instead of doing a join, I'm going to be using an in statement. So I'm going to type where and then in, and then I'm going to say supplier ID. And here, if I want to be a little bit clearer too, I could of course do an A here and then a.supplier ID here, and then say that supplier name comes from A and phone number comes from A. I don't have to do that because I only have one table in this from. I don't have a join in here. Okay, but then I'm going to say where, and the supplier ID, the field here should go to the left of the in, and then I have in, and now is where the subquery is going to come. So now I'm going to have a select statement, and importantly, I need to select a supplier ID, and I remember in the subquery I can only return one column, and the values in that column is going to be compared to the values in this column. And if I'm going to compare something to supplier ID, well, it has to be supplier IDs I'm comparing. So I'm going to say supplier ID here. It's not going to be A anymore, it's going to be B. And then where am I pulling this? Well, remember those two other tables? Let's go back to the ERD and look. So I had the supplier category membership, and this is where I have the supplier ID. And I also have the supplier category table, which I need because I'm going to look at the supplier category names. So I need to pull from supplier category membership. I'm going to call that B. And then I'm going to join that with the supplier category table, because I need to get those names out of there. And I'm going to join that on, and by the way, I'm going to call this C before I do the join. And then those are going to be joined on supplier category ID. And we can go back and verify this in the ERD diagram. So let's go ahead and see that. So here's the ERD diagram, and you can see the supplier category ID links up with the supplier category ID across these two tables. All right, and then I need to check that these suppliers are only in supplier category name of toy supplier or novelty goods suppliers. I'm going to say where C and then supplier category name, and then I'm going to use an in here, but I could say supplier category name equals toy supplier, and that, or supplier category name equals novelty goods supplier. I'm not going to do that. I can type an or, I'm going to do an in here, but this is not, this is separate from this in. This is kind of the old way we used to use in, but we can use that here too. So instead of typing novelty goods supplier and possibly misspelling, I'm just going to copy and paste it. So I have that right. And then let's see, I'm closing out the in, and then I need to close out the subquery, but I already have that down there, so that should be good. And then let's go ahead and run that and see what happens. Okay, so say supplier category name doesn't exist. All right, so that's coming from up here. So maybe if we put an alias around this, and by the way, this is not going to work, but the supplier category name is located in the supplier category table. So I'm going to say C here, because that's the table name. And I'm getting an error message here because it's not part of the outer query, it's just part of the subquery. And I'm not passing that value from the subquery to the outer query. All right, you say, so let's go ahead and pass it. Well, do you remember the rule about how many how many columns should the subquery return in the in? Well, only one column, because I'm comparing the result from the subquery to the values in the supplier ID column. So let's go ahead and run this, and I'm going to get an error message again. Oh, sorry, I need to fix that. That's no longer, so this would now be, I guess I can't even name this subquery, but I'm trying to pass it in here. So let's see if I can pass it in. And it's going to say, I don't know what that is. Well, let's get rid of that so we see whether we can actually even run the in statement the way we are running it. I'm going to get rid of that, and then we'll see here. And now it says subquery has too many columns, so I can only return one column in my in state, or in the in subquery expression. So I need to do this. So I can't really get that name in there. Of course, I could then, in this outer query, I could do a join to supplier category membership and supplier category, but then I might as well just do a join and not have the subquery, and then I can still do my where clause. So it doesn't make any sense to join this. So I'm going to have to come up with something kind of creative here. So I'm going to say toy supplier or novelty goods supplier. I'm going to put that in quotation marks. So I'm essentially creating a hard copy value here. The little bit of a problem with this is that well, let's go ahead and run that and you'll see. The problem with this is that I have these different companies here, or these different suppliers, but I don't know if they're a toy supplier or a novelty goods supplier. And there's no way for me to know that. So that's one of the problems with a subquery expression like this, is that I can't get access to the columns in these two tables, or in the tables inside the subquery, in my outer query. But let's talk real quick about what's happening here. So let's go ahead and look at what happens in this inner query. I'm going to go ahead and run this. And notice here I'm getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 supplier IDs. And these are the supplier IDs. If we look at the ERD diagram, these 5 supplier IDs are 5 rows from supplier category membership that matches supplier categories that have the supplier category name of toy supplier or novelty goods supplier. So I'm finding all the rows in here that have supplier category names of toy supplier, novelty goods supplier. Then I'm comparing those supplier IDs to all the supplier IDs in the supplier table, but I'm only keeping rows from the supplier table that are equal to those supplier IDs I found in this inner subquery. And now you might ask, why not just do a join? I absolutely agree. Let's take a look real quick at another subquery expression called a not in. So I'm going to just copy and paste the one we just did, and then I'm going to change this supplier ID here in the in statement to not in. So what this now is doing the opposite almost of what I just did. So now I'm returning only 2 rows, and neither of these were in the list that returned when I did the in. So here I have 5 rows. So this must mean I actually only have 7 suppliers in the company. But let's talk real quick about what that does. So it's simply saying I'm still returning those 5 supplier IDs from my subquery, but then it's taking a look at all the supplier IDs in the supplier table and saying, is this supplier ID in this subquery result set? If not, then go ahead and return it. If it is in there, don't return it because of this not in.